Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. As always, I'm your host, Killian, the managing editor for the Being Libertarian family of publications. So in my new role, and I think I announced it last week, I am the managing editor now for all of literature and publications for the Being Libertarian family of companies. So that includes Rational Standard, Being Libertarian, obviously, and of course our native Think Liberty. This also includes Champion Books as well, which has put out the new book, Igniting Liberty. If you haven't gotten a copy yet, I do recommend it. I've mentioned it a few times, but again, it never hurts to mention it more when we get the opportunity, especially for new listeners that are coming across this week. Now, for this episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy, what I wanted to dive into, and I'm going to skip the normal follow us on social media stuff. That stuff you'll hear at the end of the episode. I'm going to get right to the point here, which I think is fitting because of the topic at hand. What I'm going to discuss in today's episode is productivity. Not necessarily the most exciting thing, I'm sure. You hear the idea and it may not come across as something that makes you go, oh yeah, I really need to learn about this one. But I've had a couple people at this point come up to me and ask how I find the time to do the amount of things that I do. And I'll give a little bit of an explanation behind some of the extra things that I do, or some of the things my time goes towards that I'm able to accomplish inside the course of a normal week. So obviously I have my day job. That's 40 hours of my week right there. But then I also have the Bad Argument series that comes out every Wednesday. I've got the recording of this podcast, which between setting it up, recording it, doing the edits afterwards, all that sort of stuff, plus setting up cross-sharing and different things like that are associated to running a podcast, that takes a few hours up in the week as well. On top of that, though, I also have a lot of the editing that I do, a lot of work with the writers that we have, a lot of work on some of the marketing stuff that we do, some SEO stuff on the back end with the websites. There's a lot of different hats, I guess you could say, that I wear, or different things that I'm party to when it comes to the entire scope of the Being Libertarian family of publications. And some of it, again, like the podcast here, it extends past the publications part and into multimedia or some of the social media stuff as well. On top of that, I also am an avid reader. I usually go through, I don't read as much as I used to. I did used to be a pretty avid reader. A book would maybe be a couple of days out of my time, but now, I usually get to around a book every 2 weeks or so is roughly the kind of time flow I have for reading nowadays. Then, of course, I have a social life. There is time that I spend with the missus there. It's girlfriend. I'm not actually married just yet before anybody thinks that I missed announcing something out there, but, I spend some time with her. I've spent time with my family, different things like that. And I find a way to strike a balance between all of these things. And I do that by implementing certain systems. Now, the reason that I think that it's worth going through these systems with you is because I find that a lot of the time people think that they don't have the time to do things, and that belief, that kind of mental block that they put on their own capacities ends up creating roadblocks to actually going out and accomplishing the things they want to accomplish. I mean, I'm sure everybody out there at some point or another has put together a to-do list and ignored the tail half of it because, it's 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at the night now. I'm not going to have time to do these other things. I'm just going to, plow through this half a season or full season of House of Cards or something like that on Netflix, or whatever the most recent series that's come along, or the most recent set of movies that have to be watched. And there's a lot to be said for taking that kind of time to entertain yourself. I mean, I don't live like a Luddite and stay away from all forms of media that aren't books, obviously. I mean, most of the stuff we do is online, and they have to stay up with what's going on in the culture and what's going on in politics, and that involves, paying attention to a lot of things at once. But what we really stumble on, I find, just as people in general, we stumble on having realistic expectations of our time. We don't take a look at what our time is and what we can actually do with it in a realistic lens. I'm sure everyone out there has had a point where they get hit with that moment of productivity. They get that one day where they're just really motivated and they put together a list of everything that they're going to get accomplished and they dive right into it. And then they have a really successful, productive day. Then they go to bed, they wake up the next morning and they're back to normal and they just can't keep that same kind of energy going. They can't keep that same focus that they needed to keep in order to keep accomplishing all the things that they planned out when they had the energy to do so. That happens. I know I have peak and valley days myself as well, but like I said, I do use certain systems to be able to work through what I need to work through and find time to do the other things that I need to do as well. And I hope that in explaining some of these systems, that this can help you in figuring out the things that you need to do in order to get what you want done in life done. I do have to make a note, and I rail on this every single episode, and I know I'm going to get called a hypocrite for this because it seems that I've turned into a hypocrite on this one. I constantly talk about how much I dislike self-help books and how utterly just painful I find them, to be completely frank, but looking back at some of the previous episodes that I was going through, I realized that I touch on self-help style topics quite often. That was another thing that was pointed out to me, so I suppose I've got to kind of just hang my head in shame a little bit as I'm going into another episode to go through something that's going to help people you would usually see in a self-help style book. But I go through these things, and I know it's kind of ironic at this point that I'm having an episode about productivity, and I'm about 7 or 8 minutes in, and I haven't touched on the actual topic of productivity yet, which isn't all that productive. But what's funny with the self-help topics I find is that, just to clarify for anyone that's had a concern about that, I doubt anyone has actually thought about it or worried about it in any sense, but I find that the biggest issue with the self-help books or the self-help ideas is that they're not presented in a way that make them easily actionable. And tying into productivity, when we're looking at a concept or an idea and we're trying to figure out the best way to do something, we need to do it in a way that is going to be the most optimal. A lot of stuff in self-help books, from what I've seen, they're very suboptimal in the way that an average person can truly implement them. You can read the book and there's tons of useful information in them, sure, but you almost have to switch your entire life gears in order to follow through with the things that they lay out in these books, and that lacks a certain aspect of realism. If you want to be truly productive, and you're not just a naturally energetic, always going at it, go-getter type person, which I'm not by any means, despite the fact that I've been called a closet workaholic. Despite that fact, I'm just not that kind of go-getter, got to do things every single minute. I'm not that type of person, never have been. But I can get a lot done by using some of the systems that I've been talking about, and they all start with that aspect of realism. They start with the aspect of having an accurate assessment of what you can accomplish and the kind of time you have to accomplish it with. So what I'll start off with here is a little exercise. I know a decent amount of people that listen to the podcast listen to it first thing in the morning, usually on their morning commutes, or maybe for some of you out there, maybe the first few hours when you're at the office and things are a little slower and you can get away with it. But either way, a little exercise for you, something that might surprise you a little bit when you actually look at it when everything's done. What I want you to do is I want you to list out the amount of time it takes for you to do all of the things you do in a week. Now, an average week is 168 hours. Actually, every week is 168 hours. I don't know why I said an average. They're all 168 hours. Weird linguistic trip up. Ignore me. You have 168 hours to work with in a week. On top of that, we're going to take out, let's say, 40 hours for work. If you have a full-time job that takes up 40 hours of your day. We're not going to include the lunch breaks or anything like that if you're like me and you have to work 42.5 in order to counter the half-hour lunches or any kind of system like that, but we'll just say 40 hours. Then you calculate the amount of time that you take to sleep. I usually sleep about 6 hours a night, so I knock that off of that total of 168. And then I go through what's my average time for a commute. How much time do I spend prepping meals and eating them, or even traveling to go out to eat at a McDonald's or a Popeyes, or maybe sit down at a restaurant if I'm out with people. I go through how much time it takes me to do each of these things, and then when you add it all together, it'll give you an idea of how much time you have left over. What I usually do is I'll suggest that you break it into 3 categories, if you will. The first category is the musts. So musts are things like having to go to work, having to sleep. Those are things that, even with the most manipulation of your timing as possible, is just unavoidable time spent. Also keep in mind that I'm presenting this in the sense that the stuff that you want to accomplish is outside of work. Maybe you have a career and you're trying to find ways to be focused and productive at your job, and I'll get to some things you can do with that a little bit further down the episode. I was going to say down the road, and that would have been perfectly fine, but for some reason I just thought to stop that. Anyway, it's been one of those days. I edit for a living, and I've been tripping over my words all day. Anyway, carrying on. I'll get to the idea of how to manage your time more efficiently down the road, but for this exercise, simply take a look at the total math and break it into those 3 categories. So I covered the first ones, the musts, like work and sleep and all that sort of stuff. Then you can get into the needs, and I separate needs and musts a little bit here, simply because musts are completely unavoidable, whereas your needs are things that can vary, and you can find ways maybe to manage it a little better, or you can find ways to optimize that time with other things while you're working on it. So that's things like the commute to work. I would count that as a different time, or just general travel time as it stands. Another example would be the time you take to prep food, the time you take to go shopping, things like that, where there's still things that you have to do, but you can usually play with that time a little bit by figuring out when you're going to do some of it, and also working on ways to make it more efficient, or they're tasks that you can multitask in. So, for example, if you want to go through more books in the course of a month, a good way to do that is during your commutes, listen to audiobooks. That way you're still getting the information or listening to the stories that are in the books, and you're cross-utilizing that time. So unlike work, where we have to be focused entirely on work, or sleep, where we're unconscious and not able to do much of anything else, that's why there's that separation between musts and needs. The last category, of course, is your wants. So this is things like socialization, time that you put towards your own pet projects of maybe reading X amount of books in a year, or finally starting that blog you wanted to start, or maybe even just small things like planning a party for your kid's birthday, or different things like that. Work the math out for how much time you think you spend on everything you do. And I do mean everything. Calculate, the amount of time you spend in a week brushing your teeth, the amount of time you spend showering, the amount of time that you spend going for a couple of rows back and forth with your lover. Anything that takes up time, by all means, measure it, and then you'll get a real picture of where your time is going. A lot of the time, most of the people that I've suggested this exercise to, they usually end up, if they have kids, usually about 20 hours left over. If they don't have kids, they usually end up with about 40. So in the case of no kids, for example, or maybe even kids that are a little on the older side, so you don't need to be as hands-on with them per se, that's a full-time job worth of extra time that you have available to put towards all of the things that you'd want to do. That's a lot of time to be able to devote to any of the projects you had in mind or things you wanted to accomplish. I mean, a great example is going to the gym. A lot of people say they simply don't have the time for the gym, but if you work it out that you've got, 20 hours even, or even just 10 hours of free time inside of a month, and that's one of those things that you really wanted to do, well, make that 10-7 and go to the gym for, 1 hour 3 times a week. Done. Easy ways to make transitions in your life in order to get the things you want accomplished. Now, once we have that kind of math played out, that's not going to solve it for us, because we're still going to find ourselves saying, okay, I've got this much time. This is what I want to get done. Let's get to it. It's not really going to give us a system for accomplishing these things. Now, what I usually use, and this is a system that I've used in one form or another for a while. It wasn't until maybe about 2 or 3 months ago, I want to say, that I found out that there's an actual name for the kind of system that I'd been personally using. Apparently, it was a system that's been around for some time. It's something called the Pomodoro technique. So this can work when you're at work or when you are sitting down and saying, I'm finally going to write that piece. I'm finally going to work through last year's receipts. I'm finally going to work on the thing that I've been saying I don't have time for. What it is that you set aside a period of time. The traditional, according to the Pomodoro technique, is that you set aside 25 minutes. When you start the timer, and you have to have a timer of some sort beside you, preferably a physical timer, but there's tons of apps that'll do the same trick for you. You set a timer, and it goes until it's done. You work that entire 25 minutes on whatever one particular item on your to-do list, or maybe a group of 2 or 3 if you know that they're not going to collectively take 25 minutes. You work through all of them until that 25 minutes is up. When it is, you take a 5-minute break, and then you start again. So the way that the Pomodoro technique is set up is that each of those 25 minutes is called a Pomodoro. When you do 4 of them, that's when you take an extended break of 20 minutes. And during the break time, that's the time that you set aside to do the normal distracting things. So things like catching up on Facebook, catching up on maybe text messages that you'd been ignoring, or just social messages, things you wanted to go through, maybe flipping through Reddit or Imgur or whatever it is that you do usually when you're procrastinating and you're not really working towards something. Take that 5 minutes and by all means use it for those things. You're not supposed to do extra work during those 5 minutes. If you're still feeling motivated, you can skip that break and jump right back into another 25-minute session if you know that you're finally on a good train and you're good to go with these things. I don't recommend skipping the long break, but by all means go through it. The history is kind of interesting. The reason it's called the Pomodoro technique is because it's actually from Italian, where Pomodoro actually means tomato. It was called this because the timer that the inventor of the technique used was a tomato-shaped kind of kitchen timer, and he used it during university and then kind of expanded on the idea a little bit further, studied into it more to see how effective it is with other people before kind of bringing it out as a productivity method. The system that I used before discovering that this was a thing that already existed was I usually just set aside half-hour time periods. I would work for half hour, and then if I needed a break, I would get up, check my phone for a little bit. I'd give myself the time to walk outside, have a smoke, swing back inside, sit back down, and start working again. And that was kind of the same flow. I did it with 5 of those periods before taking a long break, whereas the traditional method is to take 4. But you can customize it to whatever actually fits your regular amounts of productivity, and it will adjust things to allow you to make the most of that time. The actual psychology of setting the timer and saying, I'm going to work for 25 minutes. Well, 25 minutes is nothing. 25 minutes is a very small period of time when we're saying, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to get this task done, or at least I'm going to get 25 minutes worth of this task done. The actual psychology of setting that timer really puts you into a focus. The knowledge that your time period is only 25 minutes takes away some of the pressure of sitting down and being bogged down by all the stuff that you have to do in order to get through this big to-do list you might have set up for yourself. So as far as productivity techniques are concerned, there's a lot of them out there. And you're obviously going to look through a bunch of the different options that are out there to see which one's going to best fit you. This is one that I definitely would recommend looking into personally, because for all the stuff that I do, I don't think that I would retain the same level of focus just trying to trudge through all of it on a continuous basis. I would burn out a little bit faster. But with this particular technique and having a more realistic sense of the time that I put into these things and how much it's going to take from me to accomplish everything that I set out to accomplish inside the course of a week, by being able to use these two, I guess you could say, measurement systems. The first one, the 168-week calculation, measuring your actual time, and then the Pomodoro technique, when you start to adjust it to your actual own work methods once you're into the groove of working on things, and using that as a measure for how productive you can actually be when you sit down to accomplish something. By using these two in conjunction, I find that it gives you the best opportunity to set yourself up for success in accomplishing these projects you wish to accomplish. I'll use my own example for this. When I did the initial calculation for this system for the 168 weeks, when I did the initial rundown of it, it worked out that I had about, I think it was 37 or 38 hours of free time in the course of a week. Once I took away the time I spend going to work, the time I spend on all of the other, must activities, all of the other need activities, it worked out that I had about 40 or so hours total to work with. I know I originally said around the 35, 36 kind of range. The reason I say 40-ish is because some of that time was originally earmarked for weekly social engagement that I would go to, so I would just knock the 3 hours for that off right off the bat. When I take other social things or other personal things that I want to go to or want to do, and I work it against that time, it leaves me with about roughly 20 to 25 hours to put towards actual work on the things that I want to accomplish. So knowing that means that inside the course of a week, I've got the time to sit down and record this podcast or work on articles or do any of the other things that I do. And it was because I had that knowledge that I was willing to step up and say, you know what, I will take this task on. Back in the tail end of June, when I originally joined with Think Liberty, back when Think Liberty was just on its own, and this was before any of the work or concepts or anything else with Being Libertarian or Rational Standard or Champion Books or any of that stuff came into play. Back when it was just Think Liberty, I took a look at the role, I took a look at the extra time that I had available, and I said, okay, so it'll take me approximately this much time a week to put towards this to get the things I need to get done, to get everything running the way I want it to. Okay, balanced that out, looked at other things that I wanted to do with my time, and I said, you know what, I can devote that time. I can make that happen because I know that I can devote what I need to in order to make things happen the way they need to. I didn't try to sell a pie-in-the-sky concept of turning this into an automatic full-time job where I was going to be at it, 40, 50, 60 hours a week, because I knew that I simply didn't have that kind of time to do that. But I knew that I did have enough time to take on the initial rules and requirements that were put out by, I believe it was Caitlin, who I had on last week, actually, who put out the initial job posting, if you will, for the position. So when it was working with her, I came in, I did the business plan, and I set out how much work I was going to do, all that. I didn't couch it in the amount of time that I was going to be putting towards everything, but I did break down all of the stuff that I'd be doing in the course of a week and all of the projects I'd be taking on with that kind of math in mind. Same thing when I elected to start the podcast up, because I started the podcast a few months after I had originally signed on. It was a separate thing. But again, looking at the time that I had and factoring in, how much I wanted to do this and how much of a positive I think it would be for not just myself being able to do this every week, but also for members of the Think Liberty audience that will get the opportunity to listen to some of the ideas that I had or some of the conversations it could hopefully spark. I was able to say, this is the kind of time it'll take to make it happen, so I can add that to the time that I need to do. Same thing post-merger. That math of the timeline is what allows me to take on the amount of stuff that I do without overburdening myself. Because that's one of the biggest weaknesses that a lot of motivational materials have, or a lot of productivity materials have, is that they fail to account for burnout. They don't really account for the idea that the person that's going to be doing this is human, and whatever they might be trying to be more productive at might not be their life's devotion. It might not be the sole thing that's going to take all of their focus and be the primary source of attention that drives them and makes them wake up and want to move on with life first thing in the morning. A lot of the stuff we do, we might want to get to the end results of it, like the gym example from earlier, but it doesn't mean that we're necessarily enjoying the bits in between. It's not something that really gets us motivated or going. And even the most inspiring of motivational speakers, you're going to leave the room motivated, and you might be motivated every time the topic comes up for a couple of weeks, but eventually you're going to fall back into whatever your natural motivation levels are. You can inspire people, that I do believe in, but motivation is a very internal thing. So in order to actually be productive, you have to be motivated. And no one and no thing is really going to motivate you other than yourself. You might be, like I said, inspired because you see some great cause or some great thing that makes you say, this is what I need to do. But at the end of the day, it's still you saying, this is what I need to do. You're the one that's going to be making that final call, and the one that needs to drive yourself to actually implement any type of productivity system that you come up with or any type of grand plan you might have. To do that requires you to keep that motivation. Hopefully the stuff that I've touched on in this episode, I know I only went through 2 key systems, but honestly, for any of the stuff that I've seen on productivity, on motivation, on any of that side of those dreaded self-help books that I always talk about hating, for any of the stuff that I've seen on those topics, those 2 things alone have been pretty much all I've needed to be able to force myself, so to speak, to get to the task at hand and to get through doing the things that I want to do. So again, the 168-hour calculation is the thing to look at. And the other one was the Pomodoro technique, which was, I believe the spelling is, well, Pomodoro. It's pretty straightforward. Hopefully with those, you can be able to start getting a more realistic measurement of your time and an understanding of your time. And hopefully when you do sit down, you'll have a system in place to keep yourself focused on the task at hand. Even if the task sitting in front of you might not be the most enjoyable, at the very least, you know that it'll be over in a short period of time before you've got to go back to it and get that little bit extra done, and then that little bit extra done. And then just by grinding these things out, eventually you'll get through all of it. And that's really the goal of productivity at the end of the day, is to make sure that for everything that you want to accomplish and everything that you want to do, eventually you get to the end and get it done. Sometimes, you'll get those bursts of energy that make you say, I'm going to clean my whole house today. And maybe you do get it done. But more often than not, and it's completely okay and understandable to be like this. And more importantly, it's necessary that you understand that a lot of people are like this. The only way those things get done is to just grind them out. So I'll wrap everything up here. I do want to thank everybody for listening to this episode, and of course any of the other episodes that you've listened to. I know I've got some people who've been following this podcast from the first episode, and I do want to thank you for setting aside your time every week to listen to some of the things that I have to say, and I do hope that you enjoy the content that I come up with as far as these episodes are concerned, or maybe the Bad Arguments series that I put out every Wednesday as well. I'm always open to hearing feedback. Like I mentioned on a bunch of the previous episodes, if you were listening to those, you can follow me directly on Facebook. Simply search Killian Hobbs Author. If you haven't liked the page already, then please do. You can actually message me directly through that page as well. If you have any ideas for Bad Arguments topics, for episodes of this podcast, even if you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, you can message me there and maybe we can work something out as well. Or if you want me to be a guest on yours, whatever you have in mind, of course. The other thing as well is you can use that. And I really do like hearing back from people on this one. One of the things that I've mentioned on every previous episode, or a lot of the previous episodes, is the monthly challenge thing that I put out, where every month you try to take on something new or something different, just something that either you wanted to change in your life that you haven't, or something that, you're not necessarily the most knowledgeable on or the most skilled at, and you try to come up with a way to fix that. Mine for the month of February was trying to quit smoking. I have cut back a considerate amount considering the levels that I was at through the December-January period. Haven't fully quit, so I'd kind of missed the mark as far as my monthly challenge was concerned. I'm still going to try throughout March, but I'm moving on to a different topic for this month. And this month, actually, I'm working on a bit of a writing project, and I'm going to make a point of giving that the majority of my time. A few more details on that to come down the road, so I'm not going to say too much just yet, depending on how it pans out, but that's going to be my kind of focus for the month of March. If you have any ideas for some of the challenges that you're going to be taking on, or you're looking for any assistance with them, or any source materials that might be able to help you out, I'm a big fan of people taking this idea and running with it. So, like I said, you can follow me directly on Facebook at Killian Hobbs Author. Send me a message, and I respond pretty quickly, as for most of the time. And, you just share your successes with me. Even if you don't want to go through everything else, just drop me a message and say, I took the challenge on and I accomplished this. I love hearing that kind of stuff. It always makes me feel good to see people going out and changing their lives the way they want to. So, as always, other than just my Facebook page, you can follow all of the Being Libertarian brands, including Being Libertarian, Think Liberty, and Rational Standard, on pretty much every form of social media. You can also follow Champion Books directly for any of the new publications that come out, as well as Voluntarism in Action. There's a lot of good charitable work that happens there, so you do make sure to give them a like. And if you see a cause that's worth devoting to yourself to a little bit, or at least donating to, then by all means, every bit of support for the great causes that are championed by that page are always welcome. Again, my podcast comes out every Thursday, though I'm pretty sure you're aware of it by this point. The Bad Arguments series I do comes out every Wednesday. I think I've mentioned all the websites, all the social media, and just about every other aspect so far. So I'm going to give you back your time so that you can go out and start accomplishing all the things that you want to do. As always, if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.